the world. Trading rules. Responsibilities. Good morning. Our hearing today will provide an assessment of China's past and current economic capabilities and plans, and how the Chinese Communist Party is directing and evaluating future success. In studying China for some time, it seems many often evaluate success through a Western lens, which means we overlook the CCP's key policies and practices and find ourselves often surprised when they choose a course inconsistent with global obligations and responsibilities. I welcome the fact that 9 of our 12 witnesses today have not appeared before the commission, so we'll bring fresh, new thinking to the challenges before us. For the better part of the last 2 decades, U.S. policymakers have pursued a path committed to expanding market access and opportunities aligned with global trading rules. We've actively promoted international treaty obligations protecting Hong Kong citizens and democracy, as well as sovereign rights for regional states in the South China Seas. We have consistently globally advocated for human rights and lead the world in providing generous humanitarian aid, unconditional foreign assistance, and unprecedented levels of debt relief for our poorest neighbors. We've collaborated with friends and allies in building a generation of innovation, prosperity, and freedom. And throughout this history, we have offered the statement that we expect no nation to choose sides between the U.S. and China. The time has come to acknowledge that this approach has served the CCP and creates a false choice. We must recognize it for what it is, a scare tactic that the Xi regime has promoted. Under Xi's leadership, we face an unprecedented threat which requires a collective response. As our witnesses will describe today, the CCP is accelerating and intensifying past practices to promote future industries. Today, we will look at current patterns and examine how the CCP is applying its approach in important and emerging sectors, from cloud computing to new transportation models, biotech, and digital currency. The CC's past is prologue of what is to come in critical emerging commercial sectors. Our witnesses bring expertise in how the CCP will designate and subsidize national champions, impose limits on foreign firms' access until local companies establish market dominance, restrict licensing agreements, engage in technology theft and transfer, promote massive government guidance funds to shore up future enterprises, and we will learn more about the crushing coercive tactics used against any nation, firm, or person who disagrees with Xi's vision. The choice is not between the United States or China. It is not between East or West. Indeed, localities, provinces, and citizens in China are faced with the same difficult choice. It is a choice between a world that pledges debt relief to poor nations, suffering because of China's irresponsible management of the pandemic, versus a world of the Communist Party-backed privileged state-owned enterprises, wringing opaque, punishing concessions from sovereign borrowers, and then threatening termination of political ties in the event of default. It is a choice between a world in which we promote the right of Hong Kongers and Uyghurs versus a world where crippling retaliatory restrictions on commercial enterprises are imposed against those who disagree with the CCP's genocidal slave labor policies in Xinjiang. It is a choice between free speech or censorship, between free travel or economic sanctions and threats to airlines who identify Taiwan on their schedules. Between collecting data to improve the next generation of vaccines or amassing data to fuel techno-authoritarian genetic research and surveillance on citizens around the world. It is a choice built on freedom and defined by democracy, generosity, innovation, and collaboration, or a world in which the Communist Party of China calls the shots. That is the choice ahead. I'll turn to my colleague, Mike Wessel.
Thank you, Vice Chairman Cleveland, and good morning, everyone. And I want to thank the Vice Chairman for our continuing partnership on many of these hearings over many years. I want to thank our witnesses for joining us today and for the thought and consideration they have given to their testimonies. As China's policymakers chart the course for the next stage of China's development strategy, they have a renewed sense of confidence in the government's approach and believe the model pursued by the United States has failed. CCP General Secretary Xi told party officials China is entering a time of opportunity with the, quote, East rising and the West in decline, unquote. Though they often speak of greater economic openness, in reality, Chinese policymakers have diminished the potential role of the market and have strengthened the hand of the state. There are no truly private companies of any scale or importance, as they are all increasingly subjected to the hand of the state. The Chinese government's efforts to become more self-sufficient rely on all too familiar tools, such as subsidies, extensive tax breaks, discriminatory procurement policies, and predatory pricing. The 14th five-year plan makes clear that China is not interested in reform in the Western sense, but is interested in dominating key technologies and sectors. The CCP's policies narrow the opportunities for U.S. companies operating in China, but also result in deep negative effects here in the U.S., undercutting the competitiveness of domestic firms and jeopardizing the livelihoods of U.S. workers. CCP policies have fueled a massive transfer of global productive capacity and technology to China and contributed to the hollowing out of the U.S. industrial base. The COVID-19 pandemic has painted a stark picture as to the costs of Chinese policies to the U.S. and the world, with the CCP presiding over the capture and control of key supply chains. The vulnerabilities fostered by the CCP policies have had disastrous consequences for products ranging from personal protective equipment to sophisticated technologies and services with severe consequences that can be far harder to correct. The CCP has set its sights on technologies that will shape the future. Today, we will examine the Chinese government's pursuit of leadership in particular sectors like new mobility and synthetic biology. In new mobility, the government is advancing Chinese vehicle production and exports through investment and supporting policies on autonomous, intelligent, and clean energy technologies. Their efforts may challenge the strength of the U.S. auto industry, one of the biggest drivers of U.S. economic activity and employment. Integration of digital platforms and public transportation infrastructure is supporting the Chinese government quest to acquire vast sums of data to advance the technologies, but they can also be used for surveillance, control, and repression of its people. Massive data collection is also a key feature of the CCP's synthetic biology strategy, where genetic engineering will have numerous applications from healthcare to agricultural production. These developments will be key to Chinese growth, but also have implications for U.S. competitiveness, global dependence on Chinese sources, and Chinese influence in international standard setting for these cutting-edge technologies. To our distinguished witnesses, thank you for joining us to discuss these important questions. We look forward to hearing from each of you. I also want to take a moment to thank our two primary staffers on this hearing today, Emma and Leighton. Your work is deeply appreciated. The testimonies and transcript from today's hearing will be posted on our website www.uscc.gov. Also, please mark your calendar for the Commission's upcoming hearing on China's activities in Latin America and the Caribbean, which will take place on May 20th. Let me take time now to introduce our first panel, which will address China's current political and economic conditions, the prospects for China's success, and the implications for the United States. First, we will hear from Matt Pottinger, Distinguished Visiting Fellow at the Hoover Institution. Mr. Pottinger served at the White House for 4 years in senior roles at the National Security Council, including as Deputy National Security Advisor from 2019 to 2021. Mr. Pottinger will address strengths and weaknesses in China's policymaking and the sustainability of China's stimulus-led growth model. Next, we welcome back Dr. Miles Yu, Senior Fellow at the Hudson Institute and Visiting Fellow at the Hoover Institution. Dr. Yu previously served as the China Policy Advisor to Secretary of State Michael Pompeo, where he advised the Secretary on all China-related issues. Dr. Yu last testified before the Commission at our 2005 hearing on China's state control mechanisms and methods. Welcome back. Dr. Yu will address challenges in the U.S.-China relationship caused by China's economic development strategies. Finally, we welcome Dr. Lauren Brandt, Naranda Chair, Professor of Economics at the University of Toronto. Dr. Brandt has published widely on China's economy in leading economic journals. His current research focuses on issues of industrial upgrading in China, inequality dynamics, and economic growth and structural change. Dr. Brandt will address China's increasing emphasis on indigenous innovation and the implications for China's economic growth. To our witnesses, all of your testimony will be inserted in the record and will be available on our website. We ask that each of you limit your oral comments to 7 minutes so that we can have a good round of questioning from each of the commissioners. And Matt, why don't we start with you?
Terrific. Are you able to hear me all okay?
Just fine.
Great. Well, Chairman Bartholomew and Vice Chairman Dr. Cleveland and all commissioners and all staff, thanks very much for the opportunity to speak today about the Chinese Communist Party's economic strategy and also to touch on a few principles that I believe the United States and other free societies should apply as we hone our collective counter strategy. So the Chinese communist regime's ambitions really shouldn't be a mystery to us anymore. If we listen to what China's leaders have been saying in their own language, to their own party members, and we cross-reference their rhetoric with their actions, we can see that their plans are really hiding in plain sight. So China's latest 5-year plan was published just last month, and it institutionalizes an audacious strategy for offensive decoupling. So in short, Beijing intends to decrease China's dependency on the world while making the world increasingly dependent on China, and then to use the resulting leverage to advance Beijing's authoritarian political aims around the globe. So the first step of Beijing's new strategy is to use the massive subsidies, the non-tariff barriers, and the continued theft of our intellectual property that Michael was just talking about to wean China off of high-tech imports from industrialized nations, while making those same nations heavily reliant on China for high-tech services and supplies. And second, Beijing wants to continue to purchase raw materials and some critical supplies from the outside world, but it's going to work very assiduously and deliberately to ensure that any import from one country can be easily substituted with the same import from another country. And so the strategy really leverages the size of China's economy, what Chairman Xi Jinping calls China's, quote, powerful gravitational field, while simultaneously exploiting the economic vulnerabilities of other countries. So as Xi Jinping said in a seminal economic policy speech last year, quote, we must sustain and enhance our superiority across the entire production chain and we must tighten international production chains' dependence on China, forming a powerful countermeasure and deterrent capability against foreigners who would artificially cut off supply to China. So don't be fooled by the seemingly defensive phrasing in that quote, because a deterrent is almost by definition an offensive capability, and Beijing is already demonstrating that it is more than willing to use its economic leverage offensively in pursuit of political objectives. You can consider the case of Australia, where Beijing is really treating Australia as a guinea pig on which to experiment with Xi Jinping's new strategy of offensive decoupling. They've been punishing Australian businesses for months, but also released a list of 14 quote-unquote disputes, which are really, in effect, political demands that Beijing's making of the Australian government. And that includes a demand that Australia repeal its laws that are designed to counter Beijing's covert influence operations, that Australia muzzle its free press to suppress news that's critical of Beijing, and that Australia make concessions to Beijing's outrageous territorial claims in the South China Sea. So Australia's travails, which continue to this day, they've been going on for about a year now, are really a foretaste of what Beijing has in store for the rest of the world under this new strategy. Now, fortunately, the United States, our allies, and much of the world have wised up to Beijing's goals. The policy approaches of the Trump administration and the Biden administration really have more in common than not. Allies are generally following America's lead on this, and new legislation, including the Strategic Competition Act and the Endless Frontiers Act, are expressions of the bipartisan consensus on Capitol Hill to counter Beijing's economic and other forms of aggression. So as these bills are fine-tuned before making their way into law, there are three quick principles that I'd like to share that I think would be useful to keep in mind. First, in every budget that the United States adopts, in every bill that Congress introduces, and in every partnership that government and industry undertake, we should always ask first whether the new measures that we're considering increase our leverage in this competition or surrender leverage to our opponents in Beijing. As one quick example, Congress is considering the Biden administration's plan for what I've read is a $174 billion amount for electric vehicle incentives. So I would advise that Congress has to entertain whether that plan can simultaneously move our entire supply chain for batteries to the United States. Dr. Nadia Shadlow illustrated in a recent article in The Hill that Beijing currently dominates those supply chains. So it would be the height of irony and really strategic folly if, having recently achieved American energy independence after decades of costly reliance upon the Middle East, the United States suddenly were to make ourselves dependent upon a hostile dictatorship in China for our energy needs. Second, and related to the first principle, is the need to confront the reality that no U.S. counter-strategy is likely to succeed if it doesn't curtail the mighty flow of American capital into China's military-industrial complex. Somehow, Wall Street missed the memo that Beijing is waging an existential fight whose objective is, quote, the eventual demise of capitalism and the ultimate victory of socialism, close quote. That's to quote Chairman Xi Jinping himself. So it's not too much to ask to require American index funds and university endowments, pensions, and venture capital firms to stop funding the expansion of the Chinese empire. Let Beijing finance its own bid for world domination. At the same time, we should really explore ways of reinvigorating American anti-monopoly authorities to use not only against American companies, but against Chinese state-backed monopolies that do at least as much harm to American workers. The Department of Justice has indicted the Chinese telecom company Huawei under RICO statutes, which is to say that the Justice Department views that company as akin to a criminal enterprise. How many other Chinese national champions play by the same rules as Huawei? I think we should ask the Department of Justice to find out. And third and finally, our democratic ideals have the virtue of being not only the thing that we fight to protect, but also are the sharpest tool in our toolkit. Beijing has weaponized almost everything it can think of. It's weaponized trade, data, loans, fishing vessels, social media, diplomats, genetics, you name it. But the one thing that the Communist Party cannot weaponize effectively is what it stands for, because the only thing it stands for is its own power. So we must never, ever neglect the advantage that our values provide us in this fight. And Congress has a very important role to play here by using every opportunity to speak with candor to our businesses, our allies, and to our adversaries as well about what Americans stand for and who we stand up for. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Mr. Pottinger. Thank you also for your service. It's deeply appreciated. Miles, we'll go to you now.
Good morning, everyone. Vice Chair Cleveland and Commissioner Wessel and the other distinguished members of the Commission. I'd like to thank you for inviting me today, and you've asked me to discuss the Chinese economy, the philosophical roots of China's economic system, and their implications for the United States. I've submitted to the Commission my written testimony, which is longer, and for a fuller context of my verbal remarks here. My remarks today will focus on what makes the Chinese economy distinct, how it operates, and why it thrives under a monopolistic government that exploits and challenges the global free market system. I'll conclude with the possible possible actions for the United States to take. First, the peculiar and the paradoxical nature of the Chinese economy and the West's role in sustaining it. Unlike most other communist countries, most noticeably the Soviet Union, China has been afforded the benefits of a global free market system. It enjoys largely open access to international trade, capital markets, and advanced technologies. The paradox of a communist nation fully participating in a largely capitalist system has enriched and strengthened the Chinese Communist Party to the point where Beijing poses the mortal threat to the United States and to the very international free market economic system that has enabled the rise of the communist state. In a historic mea culpa, former President Richard Nixon admitted in his later years that his initiative to open up China in 1972 might have created a Frankenstein. China is ruled by the dictatorial communist government that controls the Chinese economy and exploits the global free market system. Today, we see this most clearly in the Chinese Communist Party's ability to exploit the huge supply of cheap and skilled labor at its disposal. This workforce does not have meaningful labor protection. It does not have the right to form and operate independent trade unions to exercise collective bargaining and welfare negotiations. In Xinjiang, the site of the tragic genocide against religious and ethnic minorities, workers were put into camps and have no rights at all. The CCP has created a gigantic country-sized sweatshop, and the world is buying. The party's exploitation does not end with human capital. The Leninist centralized model of governance also means it can command the nation's enormous material resources and effectively pursue the high capital demand landmark infrastructure projects, as in the Belt and Road Initiative. These include extensive highway and railway systems, wasteful and environmentally destructive housing and hydroelectric mega projects, and of course, expensive weapons of war in the conventional and nuclear arenas, as well as asymmetrical areas like space, cyber, deep sea, and biogenetics. The CCP's monopoly on power also allows Beijing to impose strict control over financial resources, forcing non-state businesses to rely on state financing and banking institutions. In a similar vein, the CCP is unrelenting on currency control and restrictions on currency flow, which makes foreign investors often unable to send profits out of China. This creates a vicious cycle where investors are left with no choice but to keep adding on more and more capital infusion into their Chinese investments. Foreign companies also face challenges in accessing to Chinese consumer market. The government inspired and encouraged xenophobia makes many foreign brands victims of crazed national boycotts and mob hooliganism. While the advent of the Bitcoin age poses a challenge to all central banks. China views the digitalization of national currencies as an opportunity to increase its surveillance of its own people and to upend the US dollar-dominated global trade settlement and transactional monitoring system. It is taking ominous steps to explore that opportunity. China's currency control also severely restricts Chinese citizens' ability to send money abroad. This creates a destabilizing factor for the global currency system, including rampant money laundering activities. Well, the final point I'd like to make in this section is about information. Transparency is anathema to the Chinese Communist Party, including when it comes to economic data. It makes arbitrary economic growth objectives based on political impetuses rather than credible economic numbers. Lack of transparency also endangers American investors, as many of the Chinese state-owned enterprises listed on Western capital markets provide vague and opaque information, often keeping their financial records hidden from regulators and investors in free market economies. I'd like to close by answering a question that Vladimir Lenin would have asked: what is to be done? First and foremost, the United States should no longer ignore the enormous political and ideological differences between the Chinese Communist Party and the free world systems. A fully free market system of international trade cannot coexist peacefully with a socialist market economy with Chinese Communist Party characteristics. The first step I would recommend for the US government to take is an item-by-item reciprocal response to China's negative list. That list is also known as Special Administrative Measures for Foreign Investments Access, and it constitutes a comprehensive list published annually by China's Development and Reform Commission that specifies all areas and sectors where foreign investments are allowed or not allowed in China. A reciprocal response would prohibit Chinese investments in the United States in areas such as high-quality agriculture seeds, social surveys, humanities and social science research institutions, critical minerals mining, news organizations, radio and television productions, film studios, cinemas and theater chains, and the cultural performance troops, etc., etc. The second step I would recommend is involves reciprocity for Americans' private companies. Congress could create a mechanism for them to register complaints about discrimination by China. The ban on Facebook and Twitter in China should not be a Facebook and Twitter problem, but an American problem. Based on this information, the US government could take sovereign reciprocal actions against China. As it is, too many American companies are effectively held hostage by the CCP and resort to the permanent class of China lobbyists and registered agents for China, whose job is to sell, whose job is to sell corporate America access to senior Chinese officials so that they can continue making big profits and not offending the CCP autocrats, thus perpetuating America's corporate woes in a communist country. The third step, I think is the most important, is for America to once again recognize the importance of leadership. The economic challenge of the Chinese Communist Party is not a matter of if we should or should not change Beijing's paradoxical economic reality. It is a matter of if we don't change its behavior, the free world will be changed by Beijing. The Chinese Communist Party's inner circle is based on the understanding that China's struggle with America and the free world is nothing but a zero-sum game. In a world of geopolitical great power competition, the United States can and must win. And thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today on this important topic, and I look forward to your questions and to working with the Commission.
Thank you, Dr. Brandt. Now to you.
Okay. Good morning, everybody, and thank you very much again for the opportunity. Historically, China has seen itself as the center of the world, however separate and distinct. The last 15 years, a comprehensive new strategy has emerged that's reshaping the Chinese economy and its ties with the rest of the world. This represents an important departure from the policies and the changes that were the source of the dynamism and the growth the previous 30 years. It is also a strategy that harkens back to China's imperial past. Motivated by a failure of earlier policies to promote national champions, at the core of this central-led top-down strategy is a priority on indigenous innovation and technology development to provide independent control over mature industries, as well as newly emerging technologies and value chains. This strategy is complemented by efforts to leverage China's huge domestic market as a source of demand for most products. China is the largest market globally, to acquire critical resources and technology through overseas foreign direct investment, and to use initiatives such as One Belt, One Road for accessing new markets. The domestic and the global dimensions of the policy are highly complementary. Through promotion of self-sufficiency and more balanced economic growth, the major aim is to reduce the internal as well as the external risks to CCP rule. Historically, the Chinese state has seen the West with both promise. It was a source of new technology that would support national self-strengthening 150 years ago, but also danger. Western technology could directly undermine state power, while Western ideas, attitudes, and institutions might weaken those enduring features of China that have supported authoritarian rule. Today, the latter perspective dominates. With its focus on indigenous innovation and import substitution, initiatives such as One Belt, One Road, as well as more recent efforts to influence global standard setting and governance, this new strategy represents a combination of both decoupling and recoupling on new terms. What can we say about the effect of these policies? I would like to make several observations followed by several conjectures. First, China has been successful in deepening its technological capabilities in both mature industries, power generation equipment, transmission, and telecommunications, as well as newly emerging technologies, AI and platform technologies. In some newly emerging industries, the degree of localization is hard to pin down. There are also obvious cases of failure. Second, that there are clear signs of changes the last 10 or 15 years in China's economic relationship with the rest of the world. Trade has become less important at the same time that more of Chinese exports are going to emerging markets. After rising through the mid-2000s, the role of foreign invested firms in China has declined considerably, measured both as a percentage of China's exports as well as sales to the domestic market. The role of inward foreign direct investment continues to decline at the same time that we observe significant increases in outward foreign direct investment to secure markets, resources, and technology. And third, that we've seen a marked slowdown in growth in the Chinese economy the last 8 or 10 years, with growth probably less than reported and far below China's potential growth. It is important to remember in this context that per capita GDP in China is on the order of a quarter of that in advanced countries, and productivity in levels on the order of 40% or so. Significantly, the major reason for the decline in growth that we observe in China is the sharp drop in productivity growth, which had been the source of 70% of China's GDP growth through the first 3 decades of reform. One of the most important misnomers of the first 3 decades of reform is that growth was investment-led. However, the slowdown that we're currently observing is not limited to the state sector, but also extends to the private sector, which has been the source of so much of the dynamism. Following 3 conjectures. First, a case can be made that the decline in the growth of productivity and GDP are a direct product of the more top-down policies that are influencing the choices of technology, sector, and firms, as well as efforts of the CCP to exert even more control over the private sector. These policies represent important departures from the bottom-up decentralizing reforms that reduced barriers to entry, increased competition, facilitated the diffusion of new technology and know-how, and increased factor mobility during the first 3 decades of reform. Second conjecture, the global economy has been changing since the global financial crisis. Nonetheless, China's repositioning vis-a-vis the rest of the world is much more a product of internal changes than those external to China. And third, that these costs may multiply over time as China benefits much less from the global linkages and competition that were helping to drive innovation and growth, and as policies undermine the bottom-up changes that were source of the dynamism. A declining labor force, as well as the fall in the rate of savings and investment, will make these choices even more salient. On the margin, policymakers and leaders in China are trying to limit these costs with incremental reforms. We already see some of this, but these are likely to be modest and will not eliminate the fundamental tensions that exist at the moment between the economic and political of the state. Either way, the consequences of success or failure for the rest of the world are huge, albeit different. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Brandt. We're still in a virtual world, and accordingly, we are using the scenario of going alphabetically among our commissioners, and then in reverse alphabetical order for the following panel. So we will start, if you're ready, Chairman Bartholomew.
Thank you very much. Thank you to our Vice Chair and Commissioner Wessel for pulling this together, and for our witnesses, Dr. Yun and Mr. Pottinger. Thank you. I join Mike in thanking you for your service to the country. I guess I want to start, Matt, with you use the phrase offensive decoupling. And what always strikes me is that somehow the onus of all of this is put on the United States, right? I mean, that we were the ones who started decoupling, and we're the ones who need to make all of the concessions. So I'd be interested in hearing from, frankly, all three of you, how we shift that dynamic, because the Chinese are out there pitching their framework for the whole thing, and somehow the blame always gets put on us, and the responsibility for changing things gets put on us. It's one thing. The second thing is, certainly when we see what's happening with Australia, we really see that this is an extension of the deal that the CCP made with the Chinese people, or the deal they think that they made with the Chinese people, which is that they get economic opportunity, and in exchange they don't get political freedom. And it looks like that's the model. We've always talked about sort of authoritarianism, the Chinese authoritarianism model that they're trying to export, but this just seems so clear about this. And I wonder again how we work with our allies and our friends to break open what is a perception of economic dependency, and make sure that there is space for the freedoms that people currently experience. Those are my questions. They're kind of broad. Matt, you want to start?
Thanks, Chairman Bartholomew. Thanks very much. And I share your frustration at the narrative that Beijing at times successfully pushed, that the United States was somehow an aggressor that was seeking to decouple. I think the best way to expose that for what it is, which is a falsehood, is just to remind ourselves, remind one another frequently that decoupling has been Beijing's strategy in many respects now, ever since they entered the World Trade Organization. Once they got over that finish line and got access to our capital markets and to our the trade markets of the West, they began to start shutting down areas of cooperation. And I always think that document number 9, that secret circular that got leaked out, is a very good indicator of decoupling by Beijing. It basically says, reject all notions of Western ideas about the rule of law or constitutionalism. Reject the idea of a free press. Reject the idea of historical nihilism, which is really a way of saying that only the Communist Party can talk about history. It's going to be our narrative. No one else has the right to talk about that. And on and on and on. Religious freedom, all these things that they wanted to unwind. They've gone into universities and pulled textbooks off of the shelves. And so there was already a decoupling in terms of people-to-people ties and culture. But what we have now, and what you see in this 14th five-year plan, is a very explicit one-way decoupling, this offensive decoupling, where Beijing does want to decouple, but purely on its terms. And it wants the decoupling to serve its goals, but no one else's. And they're very good psychologists, the Chinese Communist Party. So they play the psychological game to make us think that we're the ones who are trying to decouple. And really what the kind of decoupling they don't want is, they still want to have access to our technology. They want to have access to our laboratories and our intellectual property. That above all, that's the thing that scares them, that gives them night sweats, is the fear that at some point we might pull the plug on their ability to gain so much access to our cutting edge technology. So I think that's the main way, but I'll defer also to Miles and Lauren on that one. Thank you.
All right, Mike, that's a very good question. Thank you, Caroline, for posing it. China has always been a gold digger in this union and played the long game, is not marrying the international system for true sentiment. It has this goal. So I think it's the two sides basically based upon two very different understanding of the incompatibility of the two systems, the Chinese system and the Western system led by the United States. In the West, we have had 40 years of fantasy. We believed the virtues of democracy, the virtual free market might change the Chinese Communist Party. The Chinese Communist Party never had the intention to be merged completely with the rest of the world. So they have been very giddy about the fact that we have not realized the reality of this union. So they call it the 战略机遇, strategic opportunities. They try to exploit this. So on the Chinese side, there has been no illusion, as Matt just alluded to, because from the beginning, they were very clear the absolute incompatibility of the Chinese model of governance and the rest of the world. So it's a matter of time, to me, that they're going to realize, and they are really ready, as Matt alluded to once again, for this ultimate decoupling after they have essentially controlled the choke points of the international economic system. So I think that's a reality that we're facing, and I'm very glad that there has been a bipartisan great awakening in realizing this fantasy is just that, it's a fantasy. So therefore, even though decoupling has never been a national policy of this country, but I think there has been a lot of reasons to believe this is also inevitable.
Dr. Brandt, are you still there? All right, he's gone dark for a moment. Hopefully he'll reconnect. I'll let our staff engage. Commissioner Borokoff, you're next.
Thank you. Let me just say first, what a great panel this is, and I appreciate you all coming. I have two different questions that fall under one category. Mr. Pottinger, your comments were ones that I hardly agree with it. And I think a large part of what you were saying was that the messaging has to change so that the people of America and our leaders and that we are reporting to from this commission start to move forward on these issues that you talk about, specifically, what happened in Australia and the fact that we just had a hearing about the investment in China and the huge amounts of money that are being invested over there. And then Dr. You specifically mentioned that China's negative list and really got down, while you just talked about the fact that we have a messaging problem. I think both of you have this concern and a belief that we ought to be doing something that's a hard policy, reciprocal involvement in what's happening. So you mentioned, Dr. Yu, that you thought that Facebook and Twitter were not a company problem, they were an American problem. And I think interpreting what you said, you thought there should be effectively a China complaint desk set up by the Congress so that American companies can say, hey, we're being mistreated, and we have to come up with some kind of response to that. So I'd like to ask both of you, if you want to expound a little bit on specifically what would you do to get the word out so that we get the support that we need? And secondly, if we were to start setting up these reciprocal responses, what would you do to reciprocate in the case of Facebook and Twitter? And either of you can go first.
You want me to go first, Matt?
Mr. Pottinger, go ahead.
Go ahead, Matt. You want to go first?
Oh, sure. Okay. Yeah, this idea that Miles brought up about reciprocity, I think is it's a beautiful concept. It's simple. It's universal. Everyone knows what that means, and it speaks to a basic sense of fairness that all Americans share. And so, while Miles and I were in government, we frequently talked about this concept. And had guidance from the president to move out with that concept. And what we found was that when we were always very clear with the Chinese, when we were retaliating for something that they had done, we didn't always retaliate in the same way. We're a rule of law society. We don't take hostages, for example, the way that Beijing does. But we will do other things. For example, if they take hostages or they refuse to allow Americans to exit China, we'll make it harder for senior Communist Party members and their families to gain visas to the United States. We'll always return the favor, so to speak. And I think that using that concept in legislation, as well as in the executive branch's diplomacy, is a pretty good guideline to follow. I think it helps get the word out too when we explain what we're doing. China, as we just discussed a minute ago, always tries to put the onus on the other side. In fact, the more aggressive China is, the more it blames the other side for being aggressive. It's part of the psychology and psychological warfare, to use China's term for it, that all Leninist systems pursue. So I think having that idea of reciprocity rooted there will make sense when the American government makes clear we're just doing this in terms of fairness. When it comes to something like China's abuse and exploitation of our platforms now, our social media platforms, this is something that is frequently confused by people that, well, wait a minute, it's a First Amendment issue. Of course, it's not a First Amendment issue. It's really up to the social media platforms, but they should be strongly encouraged not to make themselves channels for disinformation and outrageous propaganda by a genocidal totalitarian dictatorship. And it'd be like if you went back 40 years to when we just had really broadcast television, and Walter Cronkite is finishing his news broadcast. And he says, now we're turning over our primetime broadcast to an hour and a half of Chinese Communist Party propaganda. That's really what we have now. We're getting a belly full of this junk day in and day out. I think that we should encourage and provide incentives for the social media platforms to, at a minimum, label everything that is connected to Chinese Communist Party propaganda as such, and maybe even cut them off, unplug them, given how much disinformation they're pushing. And then when it comes to China's own social media platforms, they have no right. That's not a First Amendment issue. The Chinese Communist Party has no right to access tens of millions of American teenagers to push content where they're tilting the playing field all the time, tilting certain content towards those kids, and by the way, stealing the data about those kids as well. We took the step of banning 9 Chinese apps. Some of those are caught up in court. I think that some judges have been misinformed and about the idea that this is a First Amendment issue. I went to war to protect the First Amendment. I was a journalist for years. When I joined the Marine Corps, one of the reasons I did it was to protect freedom of speech. This is not a freedom of speech issue. When you're allowing a surveillance apparatus to grab a hold of all of our children, influence them, and steal their data, we should be shutting down all of those apps. And we should have legislation to back up the initial steps that the administration took late last year.
Thank you for that. Really appreciate that answer.
Yeah, let me just chime in on this too. The American is an open society by which we basically have two very distinctive features in terms of governance. One is we're a federalist system. We have a federal government, we have state and local governments. And two, our system is based on the free enterprise system. You have big companies, gigantic companies. They're different from the federal government. So there has been a unprecedented national consensus at the federal level in the last 4 or 5 years. That is, we reached consensus on China. So our policies have been unprecedentedly tough and clear and candid. So the Chinese government, therefore, they shifted the focus from dealing with the federal government on a national level, predominantly to focus on the sub-national level. Basically, they approach this open society in 3 ways. One is the focus on the governors, local, individual states, and the local government. Their penetration has been thorough using this united front work, has been very, very effective. Number 2, they focus on the American companies. So the companies basically are dealing with China separately. You know, when I was at State Department, Secretary Pompeo invited on several occasions the CEOs of American big companies doing business in China. When they came in a private setting, they exploded with complaint against Chinese government's restriction against them. But in the open, nobody wants to say anything because they will spend a lot of money on China lobbyists. Many of them, unfortunately, are former senior officials of the U.S. government. So they have contact with the Chinese senior officials. And this basically essentially is the effort to avoid the federal government, and we have laws, and we have powerful sovereign access to the Chinese government. And so the third way, obviously, is that this huge class of China lobbyists and brokers and the registered agents who work for China. So China approached this open society challenge to them, and with these 3 approaches. So I think our way is to basically to make sure that this free enterprise companies like Facebook and Google, they operate within American domestic systems. Their issues is not just their individual woes. It's the government's responsibility to protect American companies like Google, Facebook, Twitter, even though they sometimes disagree with the U.S. government actions. But it is a principle. It is the American economic interest. So I, based on that understanding, I think that it's only fair and it's the only imperative for us to take a reciprocal action against Chinese government.
Thank you.
Thank you. The gentleman's time is well expired. I appreciate it. Co-chairman and vice chairman Cleveland.
Thank you, and thank you to each of you for appearing. Dr. Brandt, I'm interested in your characterization of the Chinese economy, and as if I heard you right, you said that there is a slowdown. There has been a overestimation of their growth, and there is a slowdown underway, in part due to top-down policies. I'd be interested in a couple of things. You referenced the dynamism of the private sector. It would help us, I think, if you could define what the private sector is, because we get into a debate amongst ourselves as to whether there really is a private sector in China, or whether they are so beholden to the party that it would be unreasonable to characterize it as truly free and private. I'm interested in what you think the potential for new firm growth. In your longer written statement, you talked about there has been a reduction in new firm growth, and that will have economic consequences. And I'm interested in your views on the demographic changes, the shrinking population, the aging population, what the demographic changes mean for productivity in China. And I guess finally, given the clear warning signs that the economy will slow down, I think that the party is ideological, but not stupid. And so I'm curious how you see them adjusting their approach to generate or resuscitate growth. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Long list of excellent questions there. I need to kind of maybe just step back a little bit, because when I kind of take a look at the last 4 decades, I take a look at the first 3 decades and I take a look at the last decade. And to me, those first 3 decades were just these incredibly dynamic decades of all kinds of economic and institutional change. But what you have to get your mind around when you take a look at those 3 decades is there's an enormous amount of dynamism, but also an enormous amount of inefficiency that happens to be running through this economy at the same time. And so I think that we've been kind of misled. So I said, I think in my opening remarks, that this notion of investment-led, export-led growth, to me, those are the 2 biggest misnomers that we happen to have about the Chinese economy. This is an economy where the growth was really based on productivity. You see the productivity in individual sectors, you see it in agriculture, you see it in manufacturing, you see it slightly less in services. You see productivity growth coming as resources are allocated, again, from agriculture, labor gets allocated from agriculture to non-agriculture, as resources are being reallocated from the state sector to the non-state sector. And all of that happened up through the 1980s. But at the same time, you did have this state sector that had an enormous amounts of demand and resources. And so there's an enormous amount that was funneled through the state sector. Some of it, again, served useful purposes. Some of it was the source, again, of that investment in infrastructure that helped to increase productivity outside. But a lot of it was serving kind of non-economic objectives, as well as just helping to, in some sense, to secure, again, the power and the control of the state. So those tensions, again, have always been there. And what's important is that there's a set of reforms that occur in the mid to late 1990s. These are fiscal reforms, financial reforms, SOE reform, China's decision to enter into WTO. What these reforms did is that they put the central government and the party and the state on a much more solid footing. There are all kinds of problems during the first 15 years of reform. So they put the center on a much more solid footing. They provided much more resources for the center to be able to pursue this kind of policy trajectory that we've seen the last 15 years. But they also, again, increased the power of the center, again, in a variety of ways. It began to take the economy, in some sense, down a slightly different path that undermined an awful lot of that dynamism. Now, when we talk about the private sector, it's kind of, I often would use the term non-state sector, because throughout much of the 80s and 90s, the dynamism was coming from these firms that we used to refer to as township and village enterprises. A lot of these enterprises were firms, again, that were kind of ambiguously owned by local governments. In some cases, they were referred to as red hat firms because they were actually privately held, but in fact, that they had these red hats, again, for purposes of trying to deal again with ideological kinds of issues. But we do see an enormous amount of entry, often small, medium-sized private sector firms throughout the 80s and 90s and the 2000s that are just the source of just so much of the dynamism that we happen to observe. I believe that you're absolutely right that if you happen to be a big private sector firm today in China, you have this relationship, again, with the party that you need to be able to maintain and to nurture. And it's going to influence your behavior in a variety of ways. And that I would also say that there's a lot of private entrepreneurs out there who, in some sense, want to keep a low profile. You only want to get yourself so big because if you happen to get bigger, then you're going to run into exactly all of these kinds of concerns and issues that you raise. Just lastly, then, that you raise these issues about warning signs. They see the warning signs. They see, again, what's going on in terms of the financial markets. They know what's happened, again, to levels of debt. They know what's going on in terms of bonds, in terms of bond markets. So there are a variety of things that they are trying to do. They've been, in some sense, in this position before. Late 90s, early 2000s, people were, in some sense, selling them out, or not selling them out, but in some sense, underestimating their ability to be able to deal with fundamental problems in the financial sector. They dealt with it. So here, there's a set of issues that they're going to have to deal with. My own sense, though, is that these tensions between the politics and the economics, at this point in time, that they're more than willing to, again, to live with the lower growth, with the lower expectations, because there are these other non-economic objectives, both domestically and internationally, that they see, again, to be most important. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, thank you. Excellent answer.
Chairman, or my co-chair, quickly, Miles or Matt, did you also have any comment to that, to Dr. Brandt's comments? And if not, we'll go on to the next question.
I have nothing further to add. I agree with Dr. Brand completely.
Okay. Commissioner Fiedler.
So there's a perceptional disconnect apparently between Congress, the executive branch, elements, the Defense Department, about China versus the perceptions of the U.S. business community. And I'd like to pursue a little bit more from the Chinese view, how they doctrinaire, what's their doctrine about using U.S. business for their political ends, and clearly for their economic ends. But so, for instance, we've seen that in our hearing on the Chinese military-industrial complex and U.S. investment in that. But I'm talking not so specifically. And Miles, you made mention of lobbyists, but I mean, people make that mention, but U.S. business is scared stiff of retaliation. And I'm trying to look for the intersection of the danger that is created by this dynamic with our national security. So, Matt, you were national security advisor, so let me start.
It's a great question, Commissioner. The things have changed a little bit. You're right that there is a change in the doctrine to some extent, because before, when it was mainly useful to China to have foreign business investing heavily to train Chinese workers, help them build up a competent core of business managers and engineers and the like, China tended to, the bargain, if you will, tended to be, look, you've got to stay quiet when you're in China about what China's doing. But what you say back at your headquarters in your home country will sort of let slide. Beijing has made a very clear departure to a more aggressive approach on this now, where Beijing says, I don't care if you're sending a tweet back in Houston that no Chinese citizen will ever see anyway, because we banned Twitter. We're still gonna come after you. We're gonna ban your basketball team and the whole league from being aired.
We just lost you, Matt.
Does either of the other witnesses want to pick up?
Yeah, let me just pick up where Matt is left off.
I'm sorry.
Wait, there's Matt again.
Did I make it back?
Yeah, you made it back.
So sorry, some hiccup.
You just had it again. I had it in my computer.
All right, Miles, we'll go with you and go back to Matt later then. Go ahead, please.
Okay, so I think obviously this is a very good question, and I think Chinese attitude toward the Western technology, particularly technology-rich companies, information companies like Google and Twitter, and they know what these companies want. What these companies want is really the market share in China. So therefore, they use the market access to absolutely mold the behavior of these big companies and make them subjugated to the Chinese demand. Obviously, Facebook and Twitter are not allowed in China, but other companies like Yahoo, like Google, and they were allowed in China during a certain period of time. And when they were in China, they were allowed to join hands with some Chinese companies. The very good example is Yahoo's business gambit with Alibaba. Alibaba was a junior partner of Yahoo in the early stage. In the end, using all kinds of restrictive government regulations and state policies, and the junior partner of Yahoo in China became a gigantic entity, and eventually basically swallow Yahoo and kick Yahoo out of China, and Alibaba became Alibaba. So so that's the non-state business in China. Ma Yun's Alibaba is not ostensibly is not a really state sector, but you know, the Communist Party has absolute control over big companies like Alibaba. Once it becomes so big, once it's absorbed Western technologies, the government takes over. And I just saw a very interesting statement authored by Ma Yun a few years ago. He said, all business entrepreneurs in China will have no good ending. And that's pretty telling coming from him. This is several years ago. Because ultimately, you know, the Chinese government, you play the long game and they use market mechanism to absorb Western technologies and then make it grow big in China. Once it becomes big, and government takes over. So we see that pattern again and again. And so this is just the reason why I mentioned the Alibaba case is because almost the entire economic growth in recent years of China coming from the non-state sector. Non-state sector accounts for about 60% of China's GDP, but the economic growth almost exclusively comes from that sector. So they have this kind of, you know, dynamic and market economy power, and that basically has been controlled and subjected to a state takeover in China, like the recent experience of Alibaba has demonstrated.
Thank you. Senator Goodwin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and my appreciation to the panel for your great testimony this morning. I want to talk a little bit, as past as prologue, the topic of this panel, talk a little bit about China's ascension to the WTO and the congressional vote that set the table for that to occur. And how I mean, really build on this flawed assumption that you all really touch on in your testimony, which is that allowing that increased access, increasing integration with China, increasing market interdependence would result in benefits, would result in market reforms in China, increase human rights protection, reform to the rule of law, intellectual property protections, and the like. And quite clearly, that has not been borne out. To the contrary, they have used that interdependence and access to market to fuel their rise. But my question is, I think we see some folks now referring to that as a mistake. Mr. You referred to it as a 40-year fantasy in your oral testimony, but also a foreign policy failure. And my question, what would the world look like if that vote had been different? If Congress had to annually revisit China's trade status? What would the global trade environment look like? What would the global supply chain environment look like? Especially, Mr. Pottinger, as you mentioned, Wall Street hasn't gotten the memo, and most likely they wouldn't have gotten the memo irrespective of that vote. So what would the world look like? What individual decisions by individual companies would be different absent that vote? I'm not suggesting that it would be the same, that it would have the same impact on American wages and jobs, but curious as to what the world might look like today if that vote had been different.
All right, so let me just take that first. In 1967, President Richard Nixon, this is before he won the 1968 the presidential election, he wrote a very famous article in which he said, you know, we have to abandon our policy of keeping isolated in China. We have to engage China because an isolated China is very dangerous considering the size and its influence. And he said, our engagement with China should ultimately serve one goal. That goal is to induce change. That is, whatever we do, welcoming China to the Western world should have the goal of changing China's behavior. So back to the issue of WTO and many other issues of engaging China, bringing China into the international community. Somehow, in our decades of engagement with China, we were interested in just engaging China and forgetting that original goal brilliantly set up by President Nixon in 1967. So I would say if that vote had not taken place, we would have fundamentally changed the Chinese government behavior, because China wants to engage the world, but you have to change the way it functions, change the model of governance, because WTO is based upon philosophically a fully market-oriented economy. And China, up to this day, has not been recognized as a free market economy. So that is a very big paradox, and the world still has to resolve. So, and I think that's my guess. And if we put pressure on China and give them this condition, if you want to join this free system, and you have to be free. We did this to the Soviet Union without any philosophical dilemma. The only reason was that the world has very little fantasy and illusion about the nature of the Soviet regime. Yet we have had a 40 years of illusion, or what, as the famous writer James Mann said, the China fantasy about the nature of the Chinese Communist Party.
Yeah, let me be a bit of a contrarian just for purposes of the discussion here. Obviously, there's some internal dynamics at play in China that are significantly different than the Soviet Union, that also could have contributed to their ability to become a manufacturing and export hub, an enormous labor market, a growing labor market with the migration to the cities. So absent that vote, absent a lot, successive administrations have articulated the same policy that you just laid out. If a different policy approach had been articulated, would it have changed that dynamic internally in China that still would have given them ability, not as an extensive ability, to influence manufacturing and global trade?
So let me pick up on here, because my own take is that I don't believe it would have. If you take a look at what happens before China entered WTO, tariffs in China fell more before China entered WTO than they fell afterwards. China's exports were already growing 15, 18% in the 10 or 12 years before they entered WTO than they did afterwards. The most important thing that WTO did from my perspective is it was not so much that it offered access to US markets, although that was extremely important. But what that did is it complemented a set of internal reforms to China that have been extremely important to the dynamism and the productivity growth that we've gone ahead and that we've observed. Once you start lowering tariffs, you start having enormous impact, again, on prices and competition in that domestic market. All kinds of barriers to entry, again, to firms in China fell at the same time. China also began to lower mobility, again, of individuals out of the countryside to the cities that provided the availability of less expensive labor. So there were a variety of reforms and changes that were occurring internally that were complemented by these external reforms that helped to sustain an enormous amount of dynamism and productivity growth that we observed. Much of China's success on the export end through the first 3 decades were in relatively labor-intensive industries that over time that they've improved their capabilities in, that they were also, just because they got better at what they did, in terms of being able to develop a domestic supply chain and increase domestic sourcing. So you take a look at the dynamic over that period of time, that there was a constellation of both domestic forces and domestic reform and changes at the same time that were external, that were contributing to this dynamism. Now, none of this disputes the fact that at the same time, there were all these other things that the state was trying to do, again, with respect to multinationals, with respect to domestic market. And this just kind of reflects the fact that there's been this ongoing tension, even in policymaking in China, between these more liberalizing, decentralizing reforms and more top-down. And to me, perhaps the best indication of that, if you go and you take a look at a report called China 2030. This was a report that came out in 2012, 2013. It was commissioned again by Li Keqiang when he was the vice premier. It's a study that was done by the World Bank and by the Development Research Center. This is a study that, in some sense, you take a look at it, this is an incredibly reformist document from the perspective of 2012 that talks about reforming the nature of the state, that talks about the state playing a more regulatory role and reducing, again, the more hands-on, top-down role, again, of the state. All of this is just a reflection of the nature of these tensions that have been there for a long time, and that what we've seen over the course of the last 12 or 15 years is in some senses the more top-down, central-led perspectives are those, again, that have come to dominate policy making, in China, again, in that regard. So I think your point more generally, I believe a lot of this would have happened independently, again, of what happened in the United States, and China would have been successful in terms of productivity growth, through lowering costs, doing all kinds of things, of being able to increase, again, their presence in global markets.
Well, I would just add
Sorry,
very briefly.
Miles, the time is up. Matt, did you have a quick comment you wanted to make? Otherwise, we'll have to go on.
Can I yield to Miles to continue?
Yes, you can. Miles, quickly, though.
Okay, very quickly. I would disagree slightly because we're talking about the role of the government. We're talking about the central state. I mean, WTO obviously would have certain rules about the price control, subsidy, labor laws, and free access to the market. So all these issues, it's not just about allowing the member to join the international trade system without solving all these problems. I think Dr. Brand, you mentioned about the top-down. That's precisely the point. And we have a very different thinking about what reform actually means in China. Ultimately, it means how to strengthen the role of the government. It's the monopolistic control of China's economy. So I think, on issues of market access, labor laws, and state subsidies, all those issues would have been very different if China were not a member of the WTO.
Thank you. Commissioner Camphausen.
Thank you very much. Thanks to our panelists. My question is for Mr. Pottinger. Matt, thanks so much for being here. Your statement talked about the concept of offensive decoupling, and you've answered a couple of questions about it. You note in your statement that the first step Beijing's seeking is to wean China off of the high technology imports. But you also note the case of Australia and the measures that China has taken to punish Australia for the policies that they find unfavorable there. Yet bans on Australian lobsters and wine, or the recent case of Taiwan pineapples, or earlier cases such as the ban on Filipino bananas, as high quality as those goods are, they're hardly high tech. These bans, often of arbitrary and indeterminate duration, are simply tools of economic coercion. The actions fit neatly into the strategy of offensive decoupling that you've talked about, but it seems to me they're distinct from the high-tech approach that you discussed. Now, China needs these commodities, these inputs, but their sources are fungible. And as you note, it's a policy to seek an approach in which their sourcing can be flexible from Beijing's perspective. Yet, the abrupt bans on these key imports from individual economies, which depend so much on them, can have immediate and deleterious effects. Now, it's hard to make the case that pineapples and bananas are national security interests. Yet, the sudden and as I said, painful impacts of their abrupt ban can really have serious impacts on countries that are often American partners and allies. In the case of the recent ban on Taiwan pineapples, Foreign Minister Joseph Wu in Taiwan organized a campaign of what he called freedom pineapples, which made up the lost sales to exports to Beijing within a short period of time from both domestic and foreign partners. I'm not sure that that approach is scalable across the whole range of potential commodities that Beijing might ban. My question's really, given that long windup, are we thinking creatively enough about the policy support tools that we in the United States might engage in on behalf of and in partnership with our friends and allies, so that they're in a place to respond meaningfully to these acts of economic coercion? I fear that because they're individual, they're targeted, they're of, as I said, indeterminate duration, that we'll continue to have approach of hand-wringing in solidarity with our friends and allies, and that just seems to me to be inadequate. So I'd love to hear any thoughts you might have on how we should think about policy approaches.
Yeah, Commissioner Camphausen, that's a great point. I like how you put that. Pineapples and bananas are, a national security matter. And in terms of what we do about that, the first step, as you mentioned, is showing solidarity. I mean, when Australian wine got banned, we sent out tweets from the NSC account. I actually have a poster up in my kitchen that is a picture. It's an Australian propaganda sort of send up thing that says, "You fight communism, drink Australian wine," and we actually did buy Australian wine for a White House event. So part of it is poking fun at it, showing solidarity, but also encouraging countries to be much more nimble in their in how they hedge with their supply chains. Luckily, a lot of these things are fungible. They are commodities. So Australian beef has managed to recover. Australian coal. I don't know the latest on that, but coal is fungible. You stick it on a boat, you send it somewhere else. China still needs coal, so they're going to buy it from somewhere in the world, and then Australia can backfill wherever that came from. It's disruptive, but it's not fatal. The other idea that we talked about in the last administration, which I hope that the Biden administration picks up and runs with, is the idea of sort of an economic NATO in Article 5, that if one country is being uniformly bullied by China, that China's trying to, for political reasons, use its economic leverage to cause pain for business people and workers in Taiwan or the Philippines or the United States or where have you, that coalition would pick up the slack, that there would be some mechanism to allow for those goods to be absorbed into the economies equitably of the other members of that state. So that's a concept that might be worth pursuing, because it would help create a deterrent against China. Now, China's doing this right now because it has this market power for commodities to inflict pain. The next step is that they want to be the only supplier of the high-tech items on the supply chain, so that they can start cutting off the world, not just saying, we're not going to buy your commodities, we're also not going to send you critical supplies, semiconductors, electronics, fiber optics, pharmaceuticals, and masks when you have your next pandemic, which they've actually already done. So that's where we need to develop this concept in anticipation of the fact that China's already telegraphed where it's going with this. The term I'm using is offensive decoupling, but it is a highly coercive use of their economic leverage to achieve authoritarian political aims.
Thanks very much.
Commissioner Scissors, you're next.
Thanks. I'll start briefly by agreeing with Matt on the importance of evaluating capital flow into China. We had a hearing covering some of that, so I won't spend much time on it, but it is a crucial issue. My comments and questions are for Professor Brandt. I'll start with a completely inappropriate comment. You cited Lardy praising China's global financial crisis response. Michael Pettis and I sharply disagreed with him in front of this commission 12 years ago about China's global financial crisis response being praiseworthy. We were right, he was wrong. It's entirely off topic, and no reasonable person should have expected me to just let that go by. Turning reluctantly to relevant things and rephrasing one of your points, so there are questions actually coming now. I'm rephrasing, so I do want you to agree or disagree and elaborate if you want to. I see an R&D fad in China right now. You and I have been following the economy for a long time. We've seen lots of fads: air conditioners, TVs, steel, phones, and so on, solar panels. We're getting an R&D fad now, and following those other fads, I think we are in danger of exaggerating the importance of the level of spending. Because this is a fad, you're going to get a rush of unproductive spending. unnecessarily rapid decrease in marginal return. And so we're going to overstate Chinese R&D because this is just like when they wasted money on all those other products. And I appreciate if if you disagree, definitely. If you agree and want to elaborate, that's fine. I have a narrow question as well. The seemingly stable role of the state sector over the past decade almost looks like it's more than a decade. It almost looks like it's engineered. I'm suspicious of them being able to manage it so well. So I'm looking for other explanations. And I'm going to follow up on Rob and asking about the private sector. Can the stable role of the state sector be partly attributed to definitional issues? And the one that I harp on is, if you look at registration data, you've had this big move from state-owned to non-wholly state-owned limited liability corporations. Those are still state-owned enterprises in most cases. Whereas you look at the production data, they compress the firm type and you get state, private, and then sort of an other category. So I'm wondering about this stability you cite. Is it really engineered? Is it accidental? Or is it partly because we don't really understand the categories that well?
Okay, good. Let me just take each of those in turn. I think that in terms of R&D, I think I actually say in the report, you've seen these increase in R&D numbers, and a lot of this, in fact, reflects, again, the nature of policy and the nature of incentives that have been given, again, to firms to go ahead and to increase, R&D. You see the exact same thing in terms of the patenting numbers. And so you've seen this absolute increase in patent, an explosion in patenting. Again, over the course of the last 10 or 15 years, we know that that is awful. A lot of that is related to the incentives, again, that firms are given directly as well as indirectly, subsidies, again, for patenting, again, as well as just benefits that they realize because they happen to have patents. So I agree, again, with 100%, as we would say, there's a lot of shui fen, there's a lot of water, again, in those numbers, but what it means is that we just have to be really careful in terms of how we go ahead and how we assess, both in terms of R&D, the quality of the R&D, and the impact that it happens to be having, again, on capabilities. And so there's some interesting work that's being done that takes a look, again, at patents. It takes a look at international citations, again, to patents, again, that are coming out of China. And that is providing, a window in terms of the nature of patenting in China, how it happens to be linked or not linked, again, with other kind of patenting activity with the rest of the world. And it also identifies in those sectors, downstream, upstream, in terms of where we're beginning to see, again, in some sense, strength, again, in terms of China, in terms of its technological capability. So at a general level, I agree with you, but I would also say that we have to kind of look, again, really, really carefully in terms of what's going on, because there's no question that technical capabilities are increasing, again, throughout, again, much, again, of this economy. In terms of the state sector, I agree with you. The state sector is one of these things that's extremely hard to be able to measure, and that we want to also be able to distinguish between its contribution to GDP as opposed to the influence that it happens to be having on the rest of the economy. Here, the numbers that I was citing in the paper were just on the basis of the national income accounts. You can go ahead and you can measure the value added or the GDP that happens to be generated by state-owned enterprises. You can go ahead and you can measure the GDP contribution to government. So these are measurable kinds of things. What's interesting in the case in terms of state-owned ownership, in terms of state-owned enterprises, is that clearly that we've seen a decline over time in terms of how important state-owned enterprises are in industry. And so it's declined, monotonically. At one point it was 60, 70%. Today it's probably on the order of about 25% in terms of the contribution, again, that state-owned, state-controlled enterprises happen to have. Clearly there are issues, and in my own work, I've tried to deal with these kinds of issues in a variety of ways. There's alternative ways that you can go ahead and you can measure ownership. China themselves classifies firms, again, on the basis of ownership. You can also use information on the paid-in capital or the equity in these firms to try to identify ownership and who happens to have controlling interest in this regard. At one level, you are right that that hand of the state extends, that you see as you take a look at the state-owned enterprises and the subsidiaries that are in the state-owned enterprise groups. There's a fair amount, again, investment as minority investors in those enterprises in non-state entities, just as what we've also been seeing is more non-state investment in state-owned enterprises as minority entities in that regard. So there's all kinds of issues here, but I think what's important is that the state can influence and exerts influence in a variety of ways, all of which in some sense are distinct but may serve slightly different purposes. The fact that you happen to have these firms contributing to GDP, that's important. The state exercises, again, influence over the amount of investment that happens to go through, again, the state sector and gets classified as state investment. The state influences in terms of how the influence that it exercises over capital allocation in the economy. The state exercises influences over who gets licenses to be able to enter certain kinds of industries. The state influences in terms of how government-guided investment funds direct, again, capital to new firms in emerging industries that have been identified as strategic or key. And so I think my take on all of this is that there's just so much that we see on paper, but being able in some sense to connect the dots between what we see on paper and what actually happens and the extent of the influence that it actually has on how firms behave as well as multinationals is something that there's just like it's a big black box. And I know of very few studies, again, out there that, from my mind, have been successful in doing that. One of my favorites is a recent study that's been done in the shipbuilding industry. This is an industry where China's gone from 15% of global shipbuilding to 50%. Here's a clear case where you can see the role of subsidies for entry of new firms, production subsidies, investment subsidies, how it's gone ahead and influenced that growth and expansion. But you can also see that this has had implications not only for the global industry, but a lot of these subsidies have been extended in very inefficient ways that are actually hurting China rather than helping it. So just one more reminder of these tensions between the economics and the non-economics, that the non-economic is they want a shipping industry that's the biggest in the world. They're more than willing to live with enormous costs, short-term, medium-term, in order to be able to achieve that objective. And I think there's a growing list of industries where that seems to be the modus operandi.
Thanks. I'll follow up with you afterwards on the work on patents and citations that you mentioned. Thank you.
Yeah. I should also point out, Dr. Brandt, that their inefficiency often kicks our workers in the teeth. So something our policymakers are often interested in. Senator Talent, you're next.
Thank you, Commissioner Wessel. That was fascinating. I'm half tempted to yield my time for an actual debate between Dr. Brandt and Commissioner Scissors about who was right and who was wrong regarding the Chinese. I'm sure that would be fascinating, but I won't. The testimony so far has been great. I've agreed with the vast majority of it. For example, Matt, your point about reciprocity is really correct. As a matter of fact, it was our number one recommendation in the Commission's report last year. But I want to focus in particular, Mr. Pottinger and Dr. Yu, on a particular question. So our customer is the Congress, as you know, and Congress's major role in this competition, in the American-Chinese competition, is how to build or reform the national security apparatus so as to empower the executive. There's a sense in which, in that sense, this is very similar to the 1945-55 period when Congress built the national security apparatus that we used to prosecute the Cold War. So I want to focus, the two of you in particular, on what the Congress could do institutionally to strengthen the executive branch, in particular in the areas of investment and contesting the Chinese narrative. So what can we do similar to, for example, what Congress did with FIRMA, the Development Finance Corporation? How can Congress empower the executive in an ongoing way to be able to regulate or manage investment in China so as to protect American interests? And how can we, in an ongoing way, ensure a strong American institutional response to the Chinese narrative? I mean, speeches by the Secretary of State and Vice President or others is good, but how can we institutionalize those approaches?
Okay. Well, yeah, okay. So let me go first. This is deal with the policy. Senator, you mentioned this the prologue, which is very important. In the 1940s, late 1940s, when we faced the Soviet Union, we faced this challenge, which is global, and there was a similar sort of awakening of the nation to face this global challenge and a formidable challenge. So we did a couple of things. Number one, is we went on to convince the American people that the danger of this threat. So with Mr. X article, with the Truman Doctrine, all those announcements. So we won the argument. So we had the doctrine, but we had one very important piece that was ultimately completed by the Congress. That is the 1947 National Security Act. What that act did was basically is based upon the national awakening that was occurring at the time, and the national consensus being formed at the time. The Congress mandated restructuring of the government structure, restructuring the government entity to deal with this formidable opponent that was the Soviet Union. So what we did was, if you recall, the 1947 National Security Act centralized the American defense establishment, forming the Department of Defense, and further ended the departmentalized American Armed Services, the inter-service rivalry between the Army, Navy, and the emerging Air Force, and so put it under one centralized civilian control, responsible to one command, that is the United States President. In the similar vein, we also centralized our intelligence services, and ending the departmentalized intelligence, we created the CIA. And also accordingly, we readjusted our financial policy, our domestic civil defense systems. Everything was done by congressional act. And we're facing the similar situation in the United States right now. That is, we have one argument, we have unprecedented national consensus on the threat of China. And we have all the major speeches done by the Secretary of State, by the Vice President. And so we have a American people's backing. What we need is to end this endless, scattered, decentralized approach to China. We have so much duplication in our government efforts. Agencies of different stripes with different bureaucratic missions are doing exactly the same thing, competing for the same resources. That has to end. So only Congress can do this. And I think, every time we have a national crisis, either Pearl Harbor or 9/11, we try to centralize some kind of bureaucracy. And I think that's the high time to do it. And also, secondly, we have to put this in national security as the major argument for many of the threats we face from the Chinese. So there's an American domestic legal system. There is a wokeness going on. Many of this logical, legal, conceptual corollaries of this woke culture is stifling us in dealing with China. So we allow China to use our domestic exchange ideas, concepts to come at us. We can see from the Alaska exchange, which is very unfortunate. We must say this is not a Republican problem. This is not a Democrat problem. This is an American problem. The only way to approach that is from a national security point of view.
I agree with you on the urgent necessity. The question is, what would a new National Security Act include, particularly in the areas of investment? For example, my understanding is that, the index funds listing these Chinese companies is going to generate, unless something is done, enormous inflows of passive investment into China, financing their debt. What should Congress do? Should Congress empower, for example, the SEC to regulate the index funds in a way that isn't the case now? What should the standards be? And also, again, with the State Department, I guess I'm probably running out of time here, but with the State Department, Dr. Yu, what would you say we should do to get the State Department to institutionalize a strong response to the Chinese narrative? I mean, is it funding? Is it, if you all want to think about it and give me a response in writing, because I don't want to go well past my 5 minutes. But remember, we have to make recommendations to the Congress, and the more concrete we can get it, the better. So maybe take another minute if it's okay with Mr. Wessel, and then maybe written response.
If it can be fairly quick, otherwise we'll look for it in writing.
Okay, so I'll be happy to further engage the Commission on some specific measures the State Department should take after serving the department for a number of years. And I often say that we found an enemy and it's us. The bureaucracy is amazing, and the inter-service mechanism also can be very helpful. And I think, under Secretary Pompeo, the department was of one mind in many things, but we have so many bureaucratic turfs to fight, and I think we should really, really get rid of them through leadership only, and internal realignment of missions. And so I think, one of the major things, very quickly, is that government agencies, particularly like State Department, Department of State, is basically, a lot of career diplomats, and they're very good people, and also public servants, civil servants, and they're doing great things, but we tend to be involving us in the process of doing things. We rarely have a good time to think about which direction we're going, and a lot of times we're doing that much better, but still we're involved in the process of obsessing with doing things right rather than doing the right thing. I think that can be done through leadership. I'm glad we have that leadership and a certain degree of continuity of leadership in that regard in the last 5-6 years.
I'm going to have to cut it off there. Sorry, Matt, I see you poised to speak. Would welcome comments in writing. Commissioner Wong, I'll go to you and I'll play cleanup.
Wonderful. Well, first of all, thank you to all the panelists, Dr. Brandt, Matt, Miles. But I should say I especially am enjoying this panel because I get to see some old friends and old colleagues and Matt and Miles. Glad to see you're continuing to contribute to this policy area and fight the good fight. And I would only ask that my fellow commissioners not permit their respect for the testimony of Miles and Matt to be diminished today because of their past association with me. They are good people. But my questions really focus on Dr. Brandt's testimony. I really thought you laid out very well the overall tension between China's political and strategic goals and its current strategy and its economic goals. I mean, essentially, if I'm reading your testimony correctly, the Chinese are trying to expand and consolidate their political leverage domestically and their strategic leverage internationally at the cost of tempering their economic growth, at least economic growth that's broad-based and sustainable. And their hope here is that they can quickly consolidate that leverage domestically and abroad and have that strategy outrun whatever slowdown they have to endure in the economic sphere. But diving deeper into that kind of framework, my feeling is, my take is that the Chinese, the CCP, doesn't so much care about economic growth or economic slowdown in terms of just the economics. They only care about it, or they mainly care about it, only in terms of how it affects internal stability. So I guess my question is, what is your take on what are the key metrics that we should look at, or the key areas we should look at to see if their current strategy to outrun economic slowdown is surviving threats to internal stability? So, for instance, if you look at the labor market internally, is one of the factors rising tension between labor and capital, enhanced drives for unionization, driven by a tighter labor market and bad demographics, as well as just simple upskilling of the labor market and dealing with that internal strife, is another measure. And I'm not sure how you would measure it, but maybe it's anecdotal. More popular or populist resentment of particularly among rural populations due to rising income inequality and dealing with that internal instability. So I guess my question is that true, that in your view, that the economic growth factor here in the mind of the CCP is linked to internal instability and managing that? And if so, what are the key metrics of internal instability we should be looking at?
Okay, thank you very much. Well-articulated set of questions. I'm not so sure I'll be able to reply again articulately as you posed them. But in general, I think I would agree that the way in which you've characterized, again, my kind of opening remarks, again, about the nature of these tensions, again, is right. In terms of how they're both trying to make sure to secure both domestic as well as international control, again, in ways that are serving a common purpose. I think, this, under Xi Jinping, as well as certainly under the past and historically, I think that they are focused, again, on the domestic, again, in a variety of ways. I think that any kind of Chinese regime, again, historically, has always, in some sense, been concerned about kind of domestic prosperity. I mean, it's always concerned, again, about what's going to happen, again, if people are unhappy, if people, aren't fed. So this is very much, again, on their minds. And I would say that under Xi Jinping, this is extremely, again, important, again, in this regard. And so I think what they want to be able to do is that they want to be able to kind of continue the growth modest growth. They want to be able to continue to absorb these kids that are coming out of the universities. I mean, you have to remember that there's this huge expansion, again, enrollment in the universities that began in the 2000s. They need to find ways to productively absorb, again, these people. The number of people that are left in the countryside, it's, declined again significantly, as a lot of them, again, have left and taken jobs that are, in the cities, but they are very mindful of what's going on in the countryside. They were very much concerned, again, with respect, for example, to land issues. When there was an awful lot of land that had been expropriated by the state, again, for purposes of urbanization, a lot of kind of discontent, dissatisfaction, they're mindful of those kinds of issues. Xi Jinping, the last year or two, major initiative to try to deal again with issues of poverty in the countryside, the new modernization of the countryside. So there's all kinds of policies that are directed at exactly these kinds of things that you've happened to identify. The larger question is that how successful, again, will these policies be? And I think that that's something that's open for debate. I mean, we've seen in the past that kind of state efforts to try to deal with inequality, differences of regional imbalances, that they weren't successful because in some sense they were going through the same kind of channels and mechanisms that they'd used in the past. I mean, they had this policy of trying to develop the Great West, but much of that investment that occurred as part of that policy went through the same kinds of state channels that had been unbelievably inefficient, and rather, in some sense, trying to contribute to the development of a much more dynamic non-state sector. What it actually did is it strengthened, often the state sector in those provinces, in those regions that were counterproductive. The same thing may be going on in terms of the poverty alleviation programs that they happen to be delivering again as well. So I think the things to take a look at, and it's hard to do because it's just from a measurement point of view, what's happening to income inequality in China. We can all read the NBS numbers again that are generated, but having done a lot of household survey work in China myself and generated numbers to generate independent estimates, there's probably often a gap between those numbers that are reported and between what's actually going on. So look at those kinds of things. Look at what's happening to employment. Look at the ability of job, creation in the cities to be able to absorb, again, these people. And I think there's one other kind of dimension that's going to be important. I think a number of people are beginning to talk about is that you had this huge cohort that came out of the countryside that had maybe middle school education. So in China, that's going to be 9 years or less. But you also have this economy that's increasing in terms of its sophistication, in terms of the kinds of labor that's needed to be able to move itself forward. But you got this massive cohort of individuals who happen to have 9 years of education. And so the question is that how are you going to deal from a social perspective in terms of absorbing these kinds of individuals, providing them opportunities? And we're talking about some relatively big numbers, tens of millions of individuals who happen to fall into these kinds of categories. So I think all these things that you identify are going to be extremely important, and that the ability of the party and the state to move forward will both in terms of allowing people to meet their aspiring domestic ambitions, but we can't forget the nationalism and kind of the global recognition that China is receiving. That's also, again, also important to people within China.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to cut it off here, although, I think all of us may have some written questions, which we hope our witnesses will be able to respond to. One of those that I would ask Dr. Brandt is, having looked at the R&D figures, my understanding is that the pace of R&D spending by U.S. firms in China actually exceeds the rate of increase in the U.S., not the dollar value, but the rate of increase. And I think that R&D is probably of a somewhat higher quality. Again, in writing, if you could. Matt, I'd like to ask you or focus three. They're not necessarily quick questions, but I'll try and abbreviate your answers. Number one, we've seen, with PPE, the stranglehold and dominance of China in terms of supply chains. We've also seen that with regard to rare earths and their willingness to weaponize those supply chains. I now see a critical issue in semiconductors, and we certainly have seen the attention given to semiconductors. A specific component of that with regard to the auto sector here that has sort of popularized the issue, but I think the issue goes much deeper. So I'd like, number one, your thoughts on the semiconductor challenge and what actions of the previous administration we need to accelerate, add to, etc. That's number one. Number two, since you raised the issue of capital earlier, and also as to the issue of reciprocity, one of the sectors I have a real concern about that is in the financial sector. And that also goes to the President Trump's financial liberalization. It seems to me that may advantage China more than it advantages the U.S. by increasing the flow of funds to meet China's debt. Our firms are interested in the fees and not the implications. And, again, reciprocity, providing Chinese financial firms greater access to the U.S., to me, is fraught with peril, not necessarily benefit. And finally, quick thoughts, if you have them, on China's efforts to have a digital currency and the implications. We have a panel later today and would welcome any thoughts you have from your work at the NSC. I think that was maybe one of the legacy issues that might have merited more attention. Sorry to throw all of those, but if you had some quick thoughts.
Yeah, I'll try to be very brief on each of those. Look, on semiconductors, we took some initial important steps, but the steps we took are incomplete. And I think that we're at risk right now of things going off the rails a little bit. Remember, we put in place a foreign direct product rule. We made sure that companies cannot export to China's national champion fab, SMIC. What appears to be happening from my vantage point on the outside now is that licenses are being granted in spite of those rules in order to advantage one component of the U.S. semiconductor industry, mainly the tool makers, the equipment makers, who understandably are trying to go where the market appears to be going. But in a way that I think is going to prove self-defeating ultimately, because it's going to help China build up capacity that's going to wipe out all of the several other aspects of the American semiconductor industry. That's something that we can't afford to let happen. This is a foundational aspect of our technology for industry, for defense, and artificial intelligence, and a whole range of other things. We actually do have to protect that. I think the CHIPS Act and getting that actually funded, it's already been authorized, getting that funded is a good step in the right direction in the bucket of we need to run faster, but we also need to slow down our adversary, which has already made clear that they're not playing by market rules. So, someone told me that SMIC has an R&D budget of 150% of their revenue. Okay, that's not a company. Okay, that's just not real. That's funny money, and so we can't pretend that we're all playing by market rules here. A quick metaphor about this. We took steps in the last administration to restrict next generation aircraft engines from going to China. And of course, the GEs of the world, there's really only two. There's GE, there's Rolls-Royce. Given the chance, of course, they're going to try to sell the next generation engine. What that's ultimately going to lead to is China building wide-body aircrafts that they subsidize to end Boeing and Airbus's ability to sell into China, and ultimately to sell into other parts of the world as well. We've seen this movie over and over and over again in myriad other industries. So sometimes you have to restrain one aspect, look at an industry holistically, and I think that's what needs to happen to some extent with the tool makers now as well. Some of the older nodes of semiconductor technology, it's fine for them to sell to, but we've got to get really strategic here and really ruthless, because China is not going to be able to indigenize if they don't, not very easily, if they don't have access to that gear. People who are arguing, oh, it's too late, we might as well sell it to them because they're going to indigenize, that's a false argument, and it's demonstrably false. In terms of financial liberalization, I'm with you. I mean, the investment banks sure have a hell of a good lobby historically in Washington, D.C. I was reading a Washington Post story the other day that said Goldman Sachs's profits for the last 3 years in Asia amount to less than 4% of their profits, and I don't know what cut of that China is, but it's less than less than that. Okay, so I don't see much reward or upside for us getting involved, given all of the downside, this flow that Commissioner Scissors was talking about, and that I was talking about earlier, this flow of capital, which is essentially compensating for all the weaknesses that Lauren just spoke so eloquently about. All of this push-pull between politics and economics. This is a highly inefficient system China has. It's creaking, and we're putting scaffolding under it by giving them smart capital. We're helping them build all of their new technology firms. China can't really do that on its own as well as Silicon Valley's been able to do that. I think we need to get real. And maybe I can write you some answers on some of the things that we need to do that would benefit also Senator Talent for his question. Now, the digital currency that China's pursuing right now, this one's interesting because it was couched as sort of a defensive play by China, where they want what they were terming, monetary sovereignty. They want to make sure that the Alibabas and Tencents don't take over China, and that the People's Bank of China still reigns supreme. But that may have been the inception of this idea for digital currency. But since then, it's become clear that China has other much bigger ambitions for this technology. One is to be able to surveil and control their population and any other population that transacts in the digital currency. I mean, if you think that the United States has a lot of power through our Treasury sanctions authorities, you ain't seen nothing yet compared to people who have to transact in digital serialized currency that can be tracked its entire history up to where it is at a moment. That currency can be turned off like a light switch and rendered, meaningless. I mean, I think you'd have to be crazy to want to transact in China's digital currency, given the nature of that regime. The other ambition that they have for it, which I think will be harder for them to achieve, but we should pay very close attention to this ambition, is the idea of what they term de-dollarizing the world economy. And they dropped their fig leaf just the other day on this when one of the PBOC officials started talking openly about the idea that monetary sovereignty now also includes not having to deal with the Americans and the greenback, so that companies that want to do criminal activities or trade in proliferating dangerous weapons and committing human rights atrocities, that will all be made easier by a digital currency that China runs, that other countries, starting with undoubtedly Cambodia, the satellite state of China, as well as Russia, which, if it's not careful, is also going to be a satellite state of China. This is something that we've got to watch very, very closely, and I'm heartened to hear that this is something that you're planning to do more investigation into?
Thank you. Thank you to the three witnesses for not only your written testimony, but your great testimony today and interaction. We look forward to some further interaction and writing afterwards. And we will take a 10-minute break and return at 11:40 for the next panel. Thank you. Thank you.
Model of governance threatened decade to
welcome back. Our second panel will address trends in China's economic planning heading into the 14th five-year plan and beyond. First, we welcome back Jude Blanchette, Freeman Chair in China Studies at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Mr. Blanchette testified before the Commission at our 2019 hearing, What Keeps Xi Up at Night? Beijing's Internal and External Challenges. At today's hearing, he will address the fusion of government and markets in economic planning. Next, we welcome Dr. Ling Chen, Assistant Professor of Political Economy at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. Her research studies state business relations as well as economic, tax, and industrial policies in China. Dr. Chen will address the changing dynamics among different actors in China's economic ecosystem. As a matter of housekeeping, each of your prepared testimonies, which we appreciate, will be entered into the record. And if you could limit your oral comments to 7 minutes so that there can be a good question and answer with the commissioners, we'd appreciate it. We will be starting questioning in reverse alphabetical order, so Commissioner Wong will be first up when questioning begins. Jude?
Well, thank you very much, and thank you to the Commission for the opportunity to testify today, and especially thank you to the staff of the Commission for their acumen in organizational wrangling today, so very much appreciated. I'm going to do my best to stay well within the allotted now 6 minutes and 41 seconds remaining to make just a few points from the written testimony. The first is, I think, despite a lot of the rhetoric about China playing the long game, I believe that actually the Xi Jinping administration is decidedly focused on achieving critical policy and geopolitical outcomes over the next decade to a decade and a half. And thus, for all the focus in the United States on some of the 2049, national rejuvenation goals, which Beijing has articulated most recently at the 19th Party Congress, I actually think what matters for Beijing now and for strategists is the year 2030 to 2035. And so functionally speaking, I think that means Beijing is in more of a 100-yard dash than it is a marathon. And there are two drivers of that sense of urgency and focus. The first, and I think arguably the most importantly, and maybe picking up on some of the discussion in the previous session by Lauren Brandt, I think the Xi administration recognizes that longstanding and emergent domestic challenges can no longer be can-kicked, as previous administrations have so aptly done for decades, and also that there are new and emergent challenges that require solutions now, otherwise it fundamentally undermines China's continued rise. Previous witnesses before the Commission have stressed that from a domestic governance and regulatory perspective, China's human capital and demographic picture is stark, and I think will soon become dire. So China's workforce is shrinking, is undereducated, and lacks sufficient skills and training needed to scale and sustain Xi's grand vision of transforming the country to become a global high-tech manufacturing powerhouse. And related to this, as a previous witness, Andrew Polk, said, boosting productivity is really the only lever that Beijing has to drive new growth. And so when you add these together, I think this is why you see the impetus and the challenge facing the Xi administration. It needs productivity enhancing technological breakthroughs now if it's going to surmount human capital and demographic headwinds. Yet at the same time, these headwinds are structural in nature and place powerful constraints on how successful Xi Jinping will be in the future. Add to this a coming retirement boom, which is going to see tens, if not hundreds of millions of individuals exit the workforce. Only a significant technological leap will prevent this labor shortage from putting significant pressure on the economy. But at the same time, if the transition to an automated future is overly successful, this potentially threatens hundreds of millions of blue-collar industrial manufacturing and logistics jobs at a time when the country still has undereducated lower-income workforce. The second driver of this urgency, in addition to the domestic focus, is the geopolitical environment and Beijing's understanding of what it takes to become a truly great global superpower. Early in his administration, Xi Jinping made a remark while in Shanghai, which I think is apposite here. He said, in today's world, whoever holds the nose of the ox of science and technology innovation, whoever takes the first move on science and technology, will be able to seize the first advantage to gain what he calls first mover advantage. And so this nose of the ox strategy, to me, entails massive allocations of state capital into emerging and foundational technologies, as well as a concerted focus on technological standards and rules. How to understand why, or the underlying logic of that nose of the ox strategy, I actually turn to a comparative example here. As Lena Khan wrote in a really influential law review article, although Amazon has clocked staggering growth, it generates meager profits, choosing to price below cost and expand widely instead. Through this strategy, the company has positioned itself at the center of e-commerce and now serves as essential infrastructure for a host of other businesses that depend on it. That sort of Amazon logic, to me, explains in many ways how Beijing is acting. There's a book called Blitzscaling by Reid Hoffman and Chris Yeh, which basically recommends for startups this strategy of driving rapid growth in market share, prioritizing speed over efficiency. The understanding being, once you get dominant market position, that gives you much better position to dictate rules of the road and to sort of set your own course of action. So you're happy to bleed capital, bleed efficiency in that rush for scale. That startup strategy, to me, combined with this concerted understanding and focus of Xi Jinping on this sort of nose of the ox strategy of how gaining control of critical and emerging technologies and standards will be critical to future geopolitical competition, explains why there is such a concerted focus this way. And so, returning to my 100-yard dash analogy, if by 2030, if by 2035, China is still a dominant global power with a significant geopolitical competitor to the United States, that means the Xi Jinping model of governance will in many ways have been successful in surmounting or circumventing some of these challenges that it's now facing. But, and I'll end with my last minute here, this is far from certain. And in a way, I think Xi Jinping's fixation on technology as a salve or as the primary means by which they're going to address these challenges, instead of painful institutional reforms, possibly leads China to a situation where more and more capital is being placed on this bet of getting real breakthroughs in technology. Whereas what it would take is Xi Jinping doubling down on some of the institutional reforms which folks have been recommending for a long time, including de-emphasizing the role of the state, allowing markets to play more force in allocating resources. And so I think what you're going to see is, and this is something that Lauren wrote about very aptly in a paper, is you're going to see lots of these kind of, or some of these Sputnik-style breakthroughs, but in a universe of mediocrity and misallocated capital. So 5 seconds left. I will just summarily cut myself off. That way I'm under time.
Thank you very much. Dr. Chen, thank you for being here. Thank you for your backdrop there. I hope you and our viewers today, understand the sincerity we bring to the issue here of focusing attention on the CCP leadership, not the acts of the great Chinese people. This is important as to how we manage this debate and make sure that we don't fuel any of the hate-filled comments that have underlined so much recently. So thank you, and please begin.
Thank you, Vice Chairman and Commissioner. Thanks for having me here. Today, my testimony will focus on important economic players in China, their mutual relations, and the rise of nationwide system for technology innovation in China. I would first like to draw attention to the fact that over the past few decades, the players in China's economic system have significantly pluralized. So contrary to the general assumption that the state and state-owned enterprises are the two major economic players, China's development path has been driven by central governments, local governments, state-owned enterprises, private business, and foreign investment firms. And central and local governments have formed various coalitions with these firms to gain resources and bring development outcomes in the 1990s and 2000s. But today I don't have time to delve in detail. Since the start of the present Xi Jinping era, there have been several distinctive features. First, the decision-making has overall been more centralized, with the local governments having less room in the process of policy implementation. At the same time, the anti-corruption campaign, to some extent, have cut the networks between the state and the business and have certain effects of curbing corruption and bribing, but also led to shirking of duties among local state bureaucrats and their lack of incentives to further promote growth. But as we will see, that is not necessarily the case when it comes to high-tech technology area. And the second is domestic private business have reached a far more mature stage and have grown more significantly in terms of their size. In contrast, the rise of international tensions has reduced the role of foreign business. The momentum for the growth of private business has been decades long, not just starting from today, but compared to previous periods, top private business such as Huawei and Alibaba have significantly strengthened their roles domestically and internationally. There are two categories among these private firms, which also give rise to two types of government-business relations. The first type of business, such as Anbang and Wanda, are companies in service industries, such as insurance, finance, real estate, entertainment, that are potentially gray rhinos with financial bubbles. And these businesses display a pattern of fast expansion through policy loopholes, followed by sudden collapse or a government crackdown when they reach the red line. However, the picture is quite different for high-tech companies that focus on industries themselves. Although having experienced leadership transitions throughout these years, the high-tech firms have overall been a group of firms that the state consistently promotes. These industries, such as IT and digital quantum technology, electronics, AI, and advanced manufacturing, have a much lower risk of financial bubbles as long as they stay close to their core business. And the state has mostly focused on rewarding or helping these industries using funding, tax breaks, and talent policies, and there hasn't been much discipline policies. The increasing US-China tension and the recent tech war has pressed the Chinese business and the state to carry out more intensive R&D and raised a strong sense of urgency. The techno-nationalism is rising. The competition between Huawei and ZTE used to be really fierce, has been substantially reduced because now overcoming the technology bottleneck has become the priority. But the tech system goes far beyond these most prominent firms that everyone has heard of. The 14th five-year plan devoted significant attention to creating a nationwide system that supports science and technology development, which is the only place where a nationwide system is mentioned in the plan. Vertically, this means that the local governments at the provincial, city, and district levels would provide capital investment for major projects and offer funding or rebates for R&D costs and tax breaks. Horizontally, this means that with firms occupying the major role in research and innovation, the system connects high-tech development zones, high-tech parks, incubators, research institutions, and universities. In some cities, administrations of high-tech industrial parks have risen to be on par with city governments and sometimes are referred to directly as high-tech district governments. Firms are categorized into different tiers, usually such as startup firms, gazelles, those that passed the initial risky periods, and unicorns, those that were valued at over $1 billion US. There are different evaluation criteria for acquiring government funds, and the higher the stakes are, the more comprehensive the evaluations are. Therefore, at least in the area of promoting high-tech firms, but not necessarily in other areas, local governments are still responding strongly to central governments. And this is especially so in the recent trend of promoting the chip-making industry throughout the country, although not necessarily all efforts succeed. I would like to end my testimony with policy recommendations. First, U.S. foreign policy should differentiate between different actors and not bracket them all together. That may be more effective. And second, the U.S. government's current decoupling strategy may be counterproductive as it has propelled China to innovate even faster, even with some chance of not succeed in some industry or some areas. Given the scale they're doing that, we still need to pay attention. Instead, increasing federal funding in R&D is more urgent now than before with intensified global competition. In addition, facilitating federal investment in education and cultivating the linkages between education research and firm-level innovations, as well as public-private cooperation, are also key for winning the competition. Thank you.
Thank you both. We appreciate it. I'm going to be stricter in terms of time constraints on this panel. Commissioner Wong, you're first.
Great. Thank you to both our panelists for joining us today. My questions are for I think it's Dr. No, or just Jude. I'll just stick to Jude. All the titles I want to be proper in all of them. I looked at your recommendations in your written testimony, and I appreciate the specificity with which you outline them. I want to focus on a couple of them. You talk a little bit about industrial policy and advocate for that not being the political or so fraught with political tension as that phrase as it has been. But I just wanted to define a little bit more what you mean by that. In my mind, industrial policy usually entails modifications to trade policy, modifications to tax structures, modifications perhaps to antitrust law, making exceptions at the firm or sector level to encourage growth and development of these sectors. And at some point in the future, when these sectors or firms are at a mature level, you lift those restrictions and let them play freely in the market. But it seems that you're talking, at least in this one paragraph, a little bit differently about targeted investments or subsidies at the firm and sector level. But then you also mentioned ARPANET, which in my understanding of the development of ARPANET, that was basic research, not so much applied or industrial policy as I would define it. So maybe I should just give you a little bit of time to maybe specify exactly what type of actions you would advocate the federal government take. Is it at the firm level, the sector level? Is it basic research? Is it policy changes, or is it actual direct subsidization and investment?
Well, a very effective identification of the inconsistency and incoherence of my description in that paragraph. So it's a great question, and one of the reasons that I kept it vague is because, that I kept it ill-defined is because the important point to me is that we begin having a more mature discussion about how we can intervene in the market to make up for shortcomings in existing sort of investment trade patterns that we're seeing now, where we're feeling now the brunt effect of malinvestment or underinvestment in key technology sectors, industries that we then race to scramble to catch up on, and 5G being a great one. So I think the first conceptual shift is what you've articulated, which is a really, really good description of the historical pattern and structure of industrial policy, is we can actually redefine this in a completely new way now. We're not tied to any legacies of what industrial policy looked like in the early 80s, or indeed how industrial policy is emerging or being practiced in other countries, China being a great example of it. China uses a de novo approach to or blank slate approach to how it thinks about industrial policy, where it evolves and creates new institutions and mechanisms that we all put under the rubric of industrial policy, but just has one fundamental end of making sure there are assured market outcomes in areas that it defines as being of national strategic or economic importance. So this could run the entire spectrum of, China is not good at basic research. Most of its R&D spending is in applied research. Some elements of Chinese industrial policy are looking at strengthening basic research. And of course, China is creating new mechanisms like government guidance funds to intervene in the market to make sure capital is allocated to areas it sees as priorities. I think for us, as I said in that short recommendation, call it an innovation policy. It's really just about first determining where are the priority sectors, technologies, not only current existing ones, but trying to be flexible enough to where we provide seed funding, where we're the kind of investor of first resort to emergent or over the horizon technologies or sectors that are of importance. So this could run the gamut from, I think, a focus on basic research. Sorry, looking at the time here. So let me just to wrap up by saying it's intentionally ill-defined precisely because what we need to do at this point is reconceptualize how we're thinking about systematically intervening in the market under a rubric of something called industrial policy. But I think I think we could take it in many ways, but it's fundamentally about supporting gaps in current investment patterns in areas of technology that we see as being critical to competition in the future.
Thank you. And
Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry about that. Just with the time, I will just note that I'll be filing a written question regarding the sovereign wealth fund recommendation as well. Just concerned a little bit about how we see a sovereign wealth fund controlled by the U.S. government, the largest U.S. government, how that what unintended consequences that may have in distorting the market might have, and also just why certain countries have sovereign wealth funds. I mean, it tends to be commodity, rich or natural resource commodity rich countries that need a way to use that public ownership of that funds. They need to channel that. Anyway, I'll send you a written question on that just in the interest of time. But I appreciate your testimony. Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Talent, you're next, and then Mr. Commissioner Scissors.
Thank you. I'll be quick with my questions. Dr. Chin, you mentioned in your written testimony, I think you said orally also, that the rising international tension and especially deterioration of U.S.-China relationships, cut off supply chains, et cetera, have given rise to techno-nationalism in China. So it was my impression, and this is not my area of expertise, others here know more about it, that really China's had an emphasis on techno-nationalism for some time. For example, Made in China, I believe, was a 2015 policy. We have a really good paper on our website called the China's Techno-Nationalism Primer. So if you could just maybe explain that assertion a little bit more in your testimony. And then, Mr. Blanchett, you have highlighted in your recommendations the need for institutional reform. So I'm going to ask you what I asked people in the last panel, which is, what recommendations would you suggest we give the Congress about further institutional reform along the lines of FIRMA and the Development Finance Corporation? In other words, changes in American government institutions to enable us to prosecute this competition better in both the short and long term.
Thank you. Thanks for the great question. So yes, tech nationalism has been for quite long in China, but the versions are not exactly the same. And before the mid 2000s, the support for high-tech industries mostly are concentrated to research, basic research or research area, or Ministry of Science and Technology. And it was since the mid 2000, especially 2006, that there is a rise of indigenous innovation. And the paradigm of indigenous innovation itself has already aroused certain kind of techno nationalism, and that time is in wake of the hope that China could get a lot of core technology through the so-called paradigm of exchanging markets for technology. But China is not satisfied with their speed. So in the 2006, there's rise of indigenous innovation. But the current version is different in several regards. First, it puts more and more attention on the central role of firms in innovation, which hasn't been stressed enough in the past. And second is that the current era focuses more on core, the hardcore technology. When we talk about the rise of, or the plan of Made in China 2025, a lot of those Made in China 2025 are advanced manufacturing industry, such as advanced materials. But now, given the rise of U.S.-China tension or deteriorating of U.S.-China relations, the focus has been coming back on the hardcore technology, which the Made in China 2025 actually has been more softer on that. So I'm trying to make my point clear is that China, in the Li Keqiang's earlier proposal of 2025 plan was having a lot of components of advanced manufacturing, and is trying to say that China can make a lot of achievement, not just on the most hardcore technology, but maybe faster catch up on those advanced manufacturing technology that can take advantage of China's supply chains. But now the focus suddenly have come back to the hardcore technology. Thanks.
Mr. Blanchett.
Yeah, so just just to name one to be concrete for this discussion, one of the areas that I think, and maybe building on the idea of FIRMA, we've seen democratic market economies around the world follow the lead of the United States and try and strengthen their inbound investment screening mechanisms. But of course, that leads to a patchwork approach to dealing with China's outbound M&A. And so an idea of like what we've done with the WTO, but better and fully recognizing the China we're dealing with in its state capitalist system, is thinking about something like a multilateral cross-border M&A regime, which would essentially bring together market economies, have requirements of corporate disclosure, for example, so we can better suss out what is a state proxy or a state-connected firm, and what is a more market player. And also harmonize how we're thinking about vetting for national security concerns and investment across market economies, rather than having a patchwork where, again, there's similarities between what Canada, the United States, EU, UK, and Australia is doing, but they don't all overlap or align. So moving towards something that finds more synergies there would be an example of, we don't have an institutional mechanism for that right now. We do for trade. It's not working well. But we at least attempted to facilitate trade through the WTO. I think something on investment would be an example of creating a new multilateral institution. So I'll end there.
Commissioner Scissors.
Thanks. I'm going to echo, I don't mean to put words in their mouth, the direction of the last two commissioners. And having been a witness and been on the other side of the, in this case, virtual table, this is not a criticism. I would say I found both of your assessments of what's going on in China and the different areas to be very useful. And then I found your recommendations to be extremely abrupt and not connected really to your assessments. They sort of come out of nowhere as to why they follow and why they're justified giving your view of China. And again, there's not a lot of time. I've been a witness. I understand how this happens. And I'm not asking you for yet more work, but if you happen to have or get into, have you written something or will write something where you say, look, this is my assessment and this is how the recommendation directly follows from my assessment, and this is the evidence for why the recommendation makes sense, that would be great. It came across to me like, oh, these are good assessments, and then these recommendations came out that were not tied to the assessments. They were tied to other facts, not in evidence. And I think some of the commissioner questions have indicate some similar reaction. So that's my comment. My question is for Jude. I agree wholeheartedly that Xi Jinping is substituting technology for conventional prosperity. And I think it's really important. This is not widely understood yet. The change in Chinese economic direction as they realize they're not going to become a rich country while any of us are alive. But they could become a technologically very advanced country. I also appreciate you emphasizing the short-term competition versus the long-term competition. That's been brought up before. I think it's an important point that we get our time horizons right, or at least discuss them. But putting them together, I was confused, or maybe I just disagree, I'm not sure which, with your point about in 10 years, we're going to decide if this is successful. We're expecting extremely weak, I mean, like unprecedented weak Chinese demography in the 2030s. Most likely, very weak Chinese finance with very heavy debt levels and not a lot of wealth generation, because they're not going to succeed probably on a conventional economic basis. So why would this be decided? Just because Xi focuses on tech, and even if he's successful, why is this decided in 10 years? In other words, I'm sympathetic to your point about, hey, we have to think about the short term, but I don't want to get carried away. The 2030s, in my mind, are going to be a terrible decade for China on the direction they're going in. And so I'm wondering why you think, hey, 10 years from now, we can decide if Xi is successful, when the 10 years after that could be very poor.
I guess it's just, well, I think we're disagreeing. I think it's just a matter of judgment on when you think the rooster is coming home. Is it going to be, are we going to see a significant bite of some of these headwinds or inefficiencies and weaknesses of the system manifest in the next 10 or 15 years? And I mean, I thought, as I was saying in the testimony, I think if China is in a strong global position, that will have demonstrated that the Xi approach to dealing with these challenges, which I assess will begin significantly materializing over the next 10 years, that will show some efficacy, if not the efficacy of Xi's approach, which my sense is he's not on the right approach. But of course, that's just an assessment, which I can't mathematically prove. I guess your point is we could have a crummy 10 years and a crummy 10 years after that. And
well, my point is actually we could have a good 10 years and a crummy 10 years after that. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I hear your point. I guess it's just it's a different assessment of. It feels to me the can kicking runway, to mix my metaphors, they will run out of it in 15 years, and so indeed we're going to start seeing the really downward pressure on this, especially in the total factor productivity realm. They need to either get some massive technological explosions, which can really goose productivity. And if they don't soon, then I think 2030, you will really start to see the downward pressure manifest in China's growth rate. So I hear your point, and I don't, it's just an assessment on when the problems are going to bite. And to me, they're sooner than later.
No, I appreciate that. Like I said, we need to discuss the time horizon, and I just wanted you to I'm not saying I know I'm right, because obviously neither of us can know that. But I think it's a good thing to talk about when we're going to know the trajectory, because if part of this is Xi Jinping becomes increasingly desperate to show that he was right, we need to know when that's going to occur. So we do disagree a little bit, but I think the point you're raising is really important. Thank you.
Commissioner Camphausen.
Thank you very much. I think I'm going to follow up on Commissioner Scissors' line of inquiry with you, Jude. I think your observations about China's near-term challenges are apt. They're a very helpful reminder, even corrective of a perhaps lazy orientation that there's sometimes been manifested, but we have time, right? We have a decade and a half. So in that sense, I think it's really helpful. I guess two questions ensue from reading your testimony. The first is, to what extent do CCP leaders, and perhaps more importantly, the senior bureaucrats who support them, think of this coming decade in the same way you have, as a 100-meter sprint? These are certainly not new challenges, right? Demography is a slow-moving train, but you know where it's going to end, right? We know the outcomes, and these senior bureaucrats in China, they're not oblivious to these challenges. They're quite able. So is it the case, this is the first question, as you indicate in your testimony, that the party is betting the House on achieving a sufficient number of or critical mass of high-tech innovations, lest it be relegated to this awkward second-tier status that Barry Naughton notes? Is that really the strategy? We got to have a sufficient number of these breakthroughs, and that will get us through at least this initial 10 to 15 year period. And we'll set aside what Derek was talking about the 2030s. That hardly seems a strategy, I guess, is what I'm asking.
Well, to me, put aside your second part, which is that hardly seems a strategy. I think my argument was, and obviously not clear enough of, yes, I think the senior leadership is decidedly aware of the challenges in front of it. Indeed, I think that's why there is the massive push coming from Beijing, and especially from Xi himself, of technology, technology, technology. It is the kind of universal salve for all of the problems China has. And so, to the recognition, just put aside, I think there's a huge mismatch between Xi's focused on the senior leadership's focused on the shiny technological breakthroughs. Unfortunately for them, this is where the practicalities of some of these headwinds manifest, because you can want to have a leading EV electric vehicle. You can be the leader in that. The problem is a mechanic for an electric vehicle is a computer programmer, essentially. And you can't will a generation or a sufficiently staffed workforce of high-tech, high-skilled labor right now. And so Korn Ferry has the management consulting firm has a report out on this where they talk about this deficit in high-skilled manufacturing workforce. It's not just China, by the way, we're going to face this, but China's going to have a pretty significant deficit by 2030. So in other words, Xi has, if you look at his speeches, is saying S&T is our way out of these productivity slowdowns. What I think he's missing, though, is it's the soft stuff underneath that, which there's not a whole lot they can do about transforming the workforce. And that, to the question Derek asked, I think that's where you get the challenge over the next 10 years. The ambition is there, but there's some significant headwinds.
Good, thank you. That's very helpful. Let me just ask another quick question. I'm not sure your recommendations are uniquely positioned to address this time horizon challenge, right? As important as infrastructure, renovation, restoration, immigration reform, and so forth, as important as they are, as worthwhile as they are for us to do, they're not necessarily short-term or tied to this 100-meter sprint decade that you've talked about. I wonder if there are, and maybe we can follow up and I'll ask a question for the record, but I wonder if there are additional outward-oriented recommendations you might have that would actually more China-focused, where we potentially put stress on the points in their model that would slow down or otherwise complicate their approach.
If we could get a response to that in writing, that would be helpful, because the time's just about up. Sorry. Senator Goodwin.
Sticking to that clock on this panel, aren't we?
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and my appreciation to both witnesses for their excellent testimony and recommendations. Dr. Chen, I wanted to talk with you about a portion of your testimony where you suggest that the policy that the U.S. has implemented to counter the PRC's technological rise has certainly aroused a more unified response from China. But perhaps, in your estimation, it's been counterproductive in the sense that the potential cost may simply outweigh the gains that we get. So I had two questions. Number one, what have we seen in the marketplace? Have suppliers and other vendors, other global suppliers from Europe or Asia stepped in to fill the void as China moves away from American suppliers? And then number two, if your assessment is that the policy that we are pursuing now is counterproductive, what would a more robust and effective policy look like?
Thank you. So for your first question, well, my answer is slightly look at this slightly different. We are right now the policies in high tech area, for example, are banning the chip selling to Huawei and ZTE, for example. So it's not necessarily removing them out of market as not getting them access to chips that which actually facilitate their speed in chip manufacturing. But more importantly is we will see that there are U.S. suppliers, European suppliers and U.S. suppliers as well that have an interest in supplying and selling these chips, and they're actually they're at the semiconductor industry actually are lobbying against these because they want to continue to make profits. So the picture is more complicated. The reason they're doing that is because precisely China they think that China still doesn't have the core chip technology. So they still have seen a complementary advantage between China and US chip makers. Now, so their interest does not necessarily stand with the US government. When their interests are going to stand together with the US government is actually when China rise up to